Thank you once again for joining us for tonight's webinar, Intermittent Fasting, Should I Really Eat Breakfast? I'm Greg Berry, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Just a quick note, since we're virtual, don't be surprised if something may seem out of place or technical issues like leaving mute on pop up. If you have any problems with your video or audio, click the reconnect button at the top of your screen. This will get you back to the webinar right away. Before I introduce today's guest, I would like to know more about our audience and just how familiar with intermittent fasting you are. On your screen, you should see a short poll with 4 answers. Are you an intermittent fasting rookie who is looking to find out more about its methods? Maybe you've done some intermittent fasting but are wanting to discover other options. Perhaps you are a pro and are currently taking part in intermittent fasting, and I've already seen people in the chat say that's where they're at. And the last option is that you've never even heard of it and are open to options. I'm going to go ahead and keep the poll up for a few more moments. We would like to express our thanks to the School of Health Professions for tonight's collaboration. Without them, this wouldn't be possible with Dr. Courtney Peterson. Just so everybody knows, the webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our website tomorrow. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please place them in the chat room. We'll have time after the presentation for a Q&A with Dr. Peterson. Now, let's go ahead and stop the poll and freeze it. It looks like most of you, 50%, have done a little bit of intermittent fasting, but just don't know enough about it. 23% are rookies, 17% know nothing about it, and then 8% are pros. They've been doing it for a while. So at this time, I would like to actually introduce Dr. Courtney Peterson. Dr. Peterson is an internationally recognized expert in intermittent fasting and is an associate professor in the UA Department of Nutrition Sciences. She earned her Master of Science in Applied Mathematics from the University of Cambridge in 2003, her Master of Science in Technical Scientific Communication from Imperial College London in 2004, her Doctor of Science or Mathematics and Physics from Harvard in 2011, and her Master of Science in Health Professions and Related Programs from Tulane in 2015. At this time, welcome, Dr. Peterson. The platform is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. Great. Perfect. So I'm an associate professor in nutrition sciences, and my research focuses on the topic of intermittent fasting. So today I'm going to try to answer the question, does when you eat matter? So intermittent fasting is defined as any sort of meal timing approach that alternates periods of eating and extended fasting. Now, there's no one single definition that everyone agrees on as a minimum number of hours you need to fast for something to constitute intermittent fasting. But I would say probably the most common definition you'll hear these days is that intermittent fasting is anytime you fast for at least 12 hours at a time or longer. I prefer a slightly longer definition, such as anytime you fast for at least 14 hours at a time, for 2 reasons. So the first, if you look at data on the time that the median American eats, the median American currently eats over a 12-hour period each day and fasts for the remaining 12 hours of the day. So I didn't want to say that the median American is practicing intermittent fasting. And second, if you look at how much carbohydrates versus fats your body burns as a function of the number of hours you've been fasting, you see in the early stages of fasting that you're burning mostly carbohydrates or glucose from fuel or from stores in your liver or muscle. And it's only once you get to about 14 to 20 hours of fasting that we really see a big increase in fat burning. So that's why I like a 14-hour definition or longer. Now, there's several types of intermittent fasting that have been studied in humans, and I hope at least almost everyone takes away something new or a new type of intermittent fasting approach from this webinar today. To make sense of these very different types of intermittent fasting, I like to group them into 3 categories. Your first category is known as periodic fasting. These are approaches where you fast for at least 24 hours at a time, some number of times per week or per month. So an example would be fasting 1 day a week, which is common in many religious traditions, or fasting every other day, which is known as alternate day fasting. Your second type of approaches are known as intermittent energy restriction. It's just a fancy way of saying that you have, you're still eating on your fast days, so you're doing modified fasting. In this sort of category of approaches, you eat a very low calorie diet, some number of times per week or per month. So examples, for instance, would be maybe every other day you just eat one meal a day, and that's known as alternate day modified fasting. And I'll go through a bunch of other approaches in this category. The third type of approach is known as daily intermittent fasting, or what is now known by the jargony term time-restricted eating, or TRE. And this type of approach, you eat in a shorter time period each day, which you can do by either eating breakfast later in the day and or dinner earlier in the day. So you're basically extending your daily fast between dinner one day and breakfast the following day. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we think intermittent fasting might potentially be good for you. And these are all, the reasons that I'll share with you are all based on studies done in animals, particularly rodents. So what we know is when you have an extended period where you go without food, that kind of revs up fat burning in your body. And it's typically your fat burning is maximal anytime you fast for about 12 to 48 hours at a time. And there's also an increase in what's called metabolic flexibility, which is basically your ability to switch from burning carbs for fuel to fat for fuel. There are lots of other reasons as why. So those include that it looks like intermittent fasting reduces appetite and suppresses certain appetite hormones, which helps people lose weight. It also lowers insulin levels, and insulin is a blood sugar and fat storage hormone, so that's a good thing. It also activates a bunch of anti-aging molecules. They have fancy terms such as IGF-1, AMPK, SIRT-K, or mTOR. Those of you who are in biomedical science might recognize these terms, but basically the punchline is it looks like it acts on a lot of anti-aging molecules. And it also increases cellular recycling, which we also know as autophagy. It lowers molecular stress in the body, so it lowers the production of what are called free radicals. So it just lowers the kind of damage that happens on a daily basis in the body. It also makes your healthy cells kind of better able to withstand outside stressors, and this is known as hormesis. It also gets rid of extra sodium in your body, which in turn lowers blood pressure. And then lastly, there's some data suggesting that it optimizes your circadian or biological clock. But the punchline is there are lots of reasons why we think intermittent fasting may be in principle good for you. And now we're just trying to find out which of these are true in people, in humans. So one of the first studies done on intermittent fasting was done in about 2005 by one of my former mentors. And he studied a type of intermittent fasting called alternate day fasting, or ADF. And this type of approach, every other day you have a complete 24-hour fast, so you go without food. And in this first study, they did about a 3-week-long study in 16 people, and they indeed found that the alternate day fasting induced weight loss. So even though people could eat whatever they want on their sort of feast days, they weren't able to eat enough to offset the weight that they were losing on their fast days. And so this was some of the first evidence we had that intermittent fasting may help people lose weight. The only problem is in the same study, they found people were super hungry over time, and they got hungrier over time. And so they found that this type of intermittent fasting really isn't sustainable in people. So I don't generally recommend this type of intermittent fasting. I will say 2 newer studies have been done on alternate day fasting, and they report conflicting results on whether it's better than standard dieting for weight loss. But in general, I don't recommend this type of approach. The second type of approach that's been well studied in people is known as alternate day modified fasting, or ADMF. So this is one of the first examples of that second category of intermittent fasting known as intermittent energy restriction. In this type of approach, you alternate a modified fast day where you're typically eating about like 25 to 30% of your daily calories. So it's equivalent to about 1 meal per day, with days where you're feasting, where you're deliberately either overeating or eating a normal amount of food. And this type of approach has been popularized by Dr. Christy Verdi in her book, The Every Other Day Diet. She's done a number of really promising studies on alternate day modified fasting, and sort of smaller studies. And then she proceeded more recently to a larger study. So she did a year-long trial of alternate day modified fasting in 100 people. And the people were at random asked to either not lose weight, do sort of a standard dieting approach, or to do the alternate day modified fasting. Now, unfortunately, in this study, they found that alternate day modified fasting was not better than standard dieting. If you look at the amount of weight that the alternate day modified fasting group lost throughout the study, you can see they lost no more weight than the group that was doing standard dieting. They also found that alternate day modified fasting wasn't any better for improving your blood sugar or your cardiovascular health. The one catch that they found in this study is even though alternate day modified fasting was pretty similar to standard dieting, they actually found that it was harder for people to stick with the alternate day modified fasting in the long term. So people actually dropped out at a higher rate than in the standard dieting group. So it actually may be harder to practice this type of intermittent fasting than other types of intermittent fasting. There was one silver lining. They did find in a later analysis that alternate day modified fasting does help people who have blood sugar issues or something called insulin resistance. This is when the blood sugar hormone insulin has a hard time doing its job. And they did find that the alternate day modified fasting was better at lowering fasting insulin levels and improving this insulin resistance, which is a marker of blood sugar issues. So it did seem to be better for improving blood sugar issues than standard dieting. The third type of intermittent fasting that's been studied is known as the 5-2 diet. This type of approach is less popular in the US, but it's hugely popular in England and also in Europe. So this type of approach, we're starting to get into some of your more sustainable forms of intermittent fasting. And so in this type of approach, you eat a very low calorie diet, only 2 days a week. And typically on those days, you're eating the equivalent of about 1 meal a day. So we're starting to talk about some of these approaches that I think might be more sustainable for people. So there have been about 16 clinical trials on this sort of diet in humans. And one of the biggest studies that really put this diet on the map was a 3-month study done in 115 overweight women. And what they found is the 5-2 diet was actually better than standard dieting for reducing body fat levels, insulin levels, and insulin resistance, which is that marker of your blood sugar issues. And so this was actually the first data we had that suggested that intermittent fasting might be better than standard dieting in people. And it was actually one of the first studies we had too. It showed that people could actually stick with an intermittent fasting program. This type of approach, for those of you who want further reading, has been popularized in a book called The 2-Day Diet by Doctors Michelle Harvey and Anthony Howell, or who goes by Tony Howell. Awesome. Since then, there have been 4 year-long studies on the 5-2 diet. What's really interesting is 2 of the 4 studies found that the 5-2 diet was better than standard dieting for losing weight at about the 3-month mark. But at the 1-year mark, it wasn't better for losing weight. People lost just as much weight as if they were doing a standard dieting approach. And what they found is over time, a lot of participants had trouble kind of sticking with the program. And so I bring this up because not all forms of intermittent fasting are sustainable over time. And I think one of the things we're trying to figure out from a research perspective is which types of intermittent fasting can people do and which types have benefits. They also found that the 5-2 diet improved insulin levels, that blood sugar and fat storage hormone I mentioned, and also improved triglyceride levels after a meal, but it didn't affect most other aspects of health. The 4th type of diet I want to mention is known as the fasting mimicking diet, or FMD. This type of approach involves eating a very low calorie, low protein plant-based diet for several days at a time. So typically that's like 5 days in a row. And you repeat that, up to once a month. So you might do that, for instance, 3 times a year. And each time that you do it, you make sure the next cycle is no less than a month later. So this type of approach was popularized by Dr. Valter Longo, and he also has written quite a bit on it in his book, The Longevity Diet. And what was really interesting is Valter developed this diet because he was doing a bunch of studies on fasting to see if it had anti-cancer effects. But he found that most people couldn't actually fast for an extended period of time. A lot of people didn't want to fast for, 2, 3, 4 days, which is what they were finding they needed to do to get some benefits in treating cancer. So he developed this fasting mimicking diet where, you reduce your calories a lot, but you're still eating. And what he found from this type of approach is that it actually, at least in rodents or in mice and rats, it shrinks tumors. It reverses type 1 and type 2 diabetes. It increases stem cells. So stem cells you can kind of think of them as these special cells that can give rise to every cell in your body and help rejuvenate your body. And it also helps regenerate tissues, and it even extends lifespan. So rodents who practice the fasting mimicking diet live longer than those who adopt a standard diet. There have been a couple studies on the fasting mimicking diet. One of the first big studies was a 3-month study in 100 healthy adults. And they compared basically doing the fasting mimicking diet for 3 months to a second group of people who basically maintained their weight or didn't lose weight. And what they found is the fasting mimicking diet was better for weight loss, which is perhaps no surprise, for improving body fat levels, for lowering blood pressure, and improving a certain hormone called IGF-1, which is lower levels generally means slower aging. But it had no effects on blood sugar or cholesterol levels. One of the really interesting things, and I wish I could find a great cartoon to show you all this. This is the best one I have, and it's super technical. But one of the really cool things about fasting is we think it might actually be a really effective treatment for cancer because of something called the differential stress sensitization theory. And that's just a fancy term for saying that we think when you take normal healthy cells and you fast them, you're lowering the amount of glucose and nutrients they have and the amount of growth factors they produce. And in turn, you cause those cells to kind of go into this self-protective preservation mode. And so if you have cancer and you're fasting and you put your healthy cells in this self-protective mode, and then you undergo chemotherapy, those healthy cells, because they're already in that self-protective mode, are better able to withstand the side effects of chemotherapy, and they better survive, and there's less damage to your body from chemotherapy. Conversely, tumor cells, if you starve them of glucose and nutrients and also reduce their growth factors, because they have these mutations that still cause them to grow, they actually can't enter the same self-protective mode. And in fact, they generate a lot more molecular damage, which causes themselves to die. And so, in fact, when you apply fasting to tumor cells, it actually causes them to die at a higher rate when you treat people with chemotherapy. And so that's the differential stress sensitization theory. Now, the really cool thing is this theory is now just starting to be tested in people. And I'll show you some data from the best studies we have so far in people. So this is like hot off the press within the last year. So they did a trial in 131 patients who have breast cancer, and those patients did the fasting mimicking diet. And they did that for either 3 days prior to starting chemotherapy, or they did sort of a normal diet. And what they basically found, and this is a little hard to see, but these are figures from the actual paper, they found that there was a smaller number of tumor cells in patients who underwent or who practiced the fasting mimicking diet, whether that was measured by looking at the cells themselves or by using radiology to detect differences. So the punchline is they saw evidence of some tumor shrinkage in people, which is awesome. And they've also found in other studies that fasting does indeed reduce some of the side effects of chemotherapy. So it reduces some things like fatigue, weakness, nausea, and so forth. And they've also been able to show that some of our healthy, immune cells that help keep our body or protect our bodies from cancer actually are better able to withstand the negative side effects of chemotherapy when you do the fasting mimicking diet. The fifth type of intermittent fasting approach that's out there and that's really popular actually in Australia is known as weekly intermittent energy restriction. So this is a type of approach where you eat a very low calorie diet, say for a week, and then you don't diet and you keep kind of alternating that pattern. And the theory behind this type of approach is by alternating periods where you're like dramatically cutting your calories and then not cutting your calories, you prevent your metabolism from slowing down. And so over time, even though you are having break weeks, over time, you kind of do your body a favor by not shutting your metabolism or slowing your metabolism down. And one of the big studies that found this is known as the Matador study. And what they found is that per week that people cut their calories, they actually lost more weight when they did that via weekly intermittent energy restriction, as you can kind of see here from this plot. However, there have only been about a handful of studies on this type of approach, and overall the studies kind of conflict, so they don't all agree whether there's a benefit or not. So stay tuned. The sixth type of approach, and the one that I study, is known as time-restricted eating, which you'll see maybe abbreviated as TRF or TRE. So TRF stands for time-restricted feeding, but you can use either term. So these are your sort of daily intermittent fasting approaches where you fast for at least 14 hours a day. That's basically equivalent to eating in about a 10-hour period or less each day. Now, what I think is really special or neat about these types of approaches is they can be practiced either by cutting calories or not cutting calories. So almost every other intermittent fasting approach, you have to cut calories. And usually there's a specific prescription. Okay, you're going to cut calories by, you're only going to eat one meal this day, or you're cutting calories by 25%, etc. With time-restricted eating, you decide whether you want to cut calories or not. You're just eating in a shorter time period each day. And when you're not eating, you can still drink water or eat anything without calories. And one of the books that has really popularized this is The Circadian Code by Dr. Sachin Pandey, who did some of the, groundbreaking studies on this type of research. And at least he did the studies in rodents. So I would say at the moment, this is probably one of the most promising forms of intermittent fasting out there and probably the most popular one. So I'm going to spend a little more time talking about it today. So ever since 2012, we had a big study published showing that this daily intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating improves a wide range of things related to blood sugar control and heart health and so forth in animals. And since then, there have probably been almost, I would say, several dozen, maybe even creeping up to 100 studies in animals on this type of approach. And there's been like a really strong scientific consensus that time-restricted eating helps, at least in animal studies, helps the animals lose weight. It prevents and reverses type 2 diabetes. It improves heart health and blood pressure. It slows brain aging. It reduces neurodegenerative conditions, such as multiple sclerosis and so forth. And it even extends lifespan. So one of the really cool studies that was done is, for those of you who know of the biosphere experiments, one of the experiments done in the biosphere was to have people eat less and see if it slowed the rate at which they age. Because there was a lot of studies showing that when animals eat less, they live longer. But was really interesting when they tried to test this theory in primates, there were two different research groups that found very different results. One group found that eating less extended the lifespan of monkeys, and the other group found it didn't. And so there was this really neat study that went back to the drawing board and say, well, okay, why did these two different primate studies find different results? And what they found, interestingly enough, is one of the primate sites fed the monkeys twice a day, and that group did not see any life extending benefits. And the other one fed monkeys once a day. So they went back and tested in these rodents to see, okay, was it differences in diet quality or the timing meals, etc. And what they were able to find is nearly almost about half of the benefits, life extending benefits of what we call calorie restriction or eating less are not actually due to eating less. It's actually due to eating in a shorter time period each day. So we now know that daily intermittent fasting extends lifespan, at least in animals. So I think that's really neat. The other thing is that we now also know that time-restricted eating, if you follow it, at least if rodents follow it 5 out of 7 days a week, they get much of the same benefit as following it daily. So you don't have to practice this every day to get benefits, which I think is really important given our busy lifestyle. And then the other thing that's important, I think, to note is the benefits are proportional to how long you fast. So if you currently eat over, say, a 14-hour period, and you now eat over a 10-hour period versus an 8-hour period, you'll get even more benefits from eating over an even shorter number of hours per day. One of the studies that really helped demonstrate that time-restricted eating may have benefits in people was this study done out of Krista Verity's lab. She took 23 overweight people, and she had them practice time-restricted eating by starting eating around at 10 a.m. and finishing around 6 p.m. And she compared that to people who were told not to lose weight. And on average, she found that people were able to stick with it just over about 5.5 days a week. They lost about 2.5% of their body weight, which is pretty good. And they had about an 8-point decrease in their systolic blood pressure. They didn't find any improvements in other aspects of health, but this is pretty good. Another study, one of the early studies was done in adults who lift weights. And because one of the common questions we often get is, well, what's the effect of intermittent fasting on, playing sports or lifting weights or building muscle and so forth? So this is a pretty encouraging little study. It was an 8-week-long study in about 34 people who were lifting weight. And they compared time-restricted eating, where participants ate between 1 p.m. and 9 p.m. versus eating over the course of the entire day. So that in this study, it was about 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. And what they found is that time-restricted eating decreased body fat by about 1.3 kilograms. And the good news is it did not negatively affect muscle mass or strength. So the weightlifters were still able to lift the same amount of weight. They also found slight improvements in triglyceride levels, and they also found that time-restricted eating improved one marker of inflammation. Another study that I want to highlight is a recent study done in the last year. It was a 12-week long study in 120 people with type 2 diabetes, where they were testing time-restricted eating. And in this particular study, they did a 10-hour time-restricted eating window starting at 8 a.m. and ending at 6 p.m. And they compared that with no instructions on when to eat. And what they found is that time-restricted eating was better for lowering blood sugar control as measured by a certain molecule called hemoglobin A1C. But this lower values mean more improvements in blood sugar. They also found greater improvements in fasting blood sugar and greater weight loss. And they also found improvements in insulin and cholesterol. So they found a bunch of different improvements in health. And if you look at what are called reviews and meta-analyses, so these are studies that look at all the available research that's been done and say, okay, this study found an improvement, this one didn't. What happens if we pull all that data and come up with the net effect? If you look at recent reviews and meta-analyses of time-restricted eating, they do suggest about a modest to moderate benefit for weight loss. So it depends obviously on the time frame, but typically for a few months, most studies report that people who do time-restricted eating lose about 2 to 3% of their body weight. Even though most studies of time-restricted eating in humans have found some sort of benefit for either blood sugar control or heart health or so forth, not all studies have found a benefit. And interestingly, the small number of studies that have not found a benefit have generally involved eating later in the day. So on one of those studies, it was a 12-week long trial in 116 people, and people were at random asked to either practice time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast and eating between 12 to 8 p.m., or to eat 3 meals a day, where your first meal of the day had to be at like a conventional breakfast time, like 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. And so the time-restricted eating group in this study actually ate later in the day than the control group. And interestingly, in this study, they found no difference in weight loss between the two groups. These are all the data points, that people logged every day of the study. And you can see there's really not much of a separation between the two lines. So there was no difference in weight loss. And the one downside they found in this particular study is the group that practiced time-restricted eating lost a tiny amount of muscle mass. Now, the amount they lost was really small, so not an amount that we normally are concerned with and so forth. And it could also just be due to water weight, but just a caution that there may be some negative effects from skipping breakfast, and it could be because people eat less protein, or it could be other reasons as well. And another study that studied what I call late time-restricted eating. So this is where you skip both breakfast and lunch. So you practice time-restricted eating not only by skipping breakfast, but also lunch. Actually found that was worse than eating 3 meals a day. So in this particular study that I'm showing you here, participants either ate 3 meals a day, or they ate a single meal per day at dinner time between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. And what they found is that late time-restricted eating raised blood sugar levels dramatically relative to eating 3 meals a day. It also worsened insulin levels, blood pressure levels, and also cholesterol levels. So practicing time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast and or breakfast and or lunch may not have any benefit, or may in fact actually be bad for you. And the reason for this is because we all have an internal biological clock or body clock known as the circadian system. And our circadian clocks produce these approximately 24-hour rhythms in our physiology, metabolism, and behavior. So to give you some examples, your best coordination, fastest reaction time, and greatest muscular strength are in the afternoon. So that's kind of the best time of day if you're an Olympic athlete to compete. Your body starts producing the hormone melatonin in the evening, and that hormone helps you fall asleep. And conversely, you have your greatest alertness and your fastest increase in blood pressure in the morning. You also have your best blood sugar control, or at least most people have their best blood sugar control in the morning as well. So basically what the circadian clock does, said in simple terms, is makes you better at doing certain things at different times of the day. Now, one of the most important of these rhythms is your daily rhythm and your blood sugar control. So if you take a blood sugar test in the morning, say at 9 a.m., in the afternoon, say at 3 p.m., or in the evening at 8 p.m., your blood sugar levels actually rise significantly higher in the afternoon and the evening, even if you're drinking the same amount of that sugar water. Those of you who have ever been pregnant and had a kid, you probably remember that gross orange-colored drink you had to drink. So they were testing your blood sugar levels. If you do that test at different times of day, you'll find that in most people, your best blood sugar control is in the morning. You can also see that from certain research studies where they've given people 3 identical meals to eat, at typical breakfast time, lunch times, and dinner time. And you can see in comparison to breakfast, when you're eating the same meal at dinner, your blood sugar levels spike higher and they remain elevated for longer. So we've actually known about this effect for about 50 years, that in most people, your best blood sugar control is in the morning. And I'm often asked, okay, exactly when in the morning? It's about mid-morning that you have your best blood sugar control in most people, with the exception of shift workers and also potentially people with type 2 diabetes. Now, these rhythms that are in our body are generated, the way you can think about it is like every single organ and tissue in our body has its own kind of circadian clock that keeps time. So it's like your lungs have a clock, your brain has a clock, your liver has a clock, and so forth. Now, to make sense of these clocks, we kind of group them into 2 systems or 2 parts. The first is what's called the central or master clock in the brain. So I'm going to make an analogy to an orchestra. The central clock in your brain is kind of like the conductor of an orchestra. It kind of conducts a lot of the other clocks in the rest of the body. Now, what's really important about the clock in your brain is its time zone is set by when you get bright light exposure, or that's the most important factor. But for all the rest of the clocks in your body, which are located in different other organs, which we call peripheral clocks because they're not in the brain, you can think of them in analogy to the different sections of an orchestra. So, your wood section, your brass section, your wind section, etc. And for these clocks, their time zones are set by a variety of factors, but one of the most important is the time of day that you eat. So given this orchestra analogy, if the conductor starts playing a piece of music based on when it's bright, when he or she sees bright light outside, but each section of the orchestra starts playing as soon as they get food, what you'll realize is that when you're eating out of sync with when you habitually get bright light exposure, it's as if your clock systems are in different time zones and they give conflicting signals about when to rev your metabolism up or to rev down. Or using our orchestra analogy, it would be like the different sections of the orchestra playing out of sync. Instead of getting beautiful music, which for us would be a beautiful, well-working metabolism, you get this cacophony of sounds because everyone's out of sync when they're playing a piece. And the equivalent to being out of sync when playing the piece is problems with your metabolism. So in one of the first studies to really demonstrate that eating out of sync with when you usually get bright light exposure creates a problem was a study done in 2009. And they took mice and they had the mice either eat when they should be sleeping or eat during their normal waking period. And what they found is the mice who ate when they should be sleeping gained significantly more weight, even though they were eating the exact same amount of food and exercising the same amount as the group that ate, during the mouse daytime. So you might see that data and say, great, I just won't eat late at night. But there's actually also data suggesting that when you eat during the daytime matters as well. So there's been a bunch of really great research out of Israel showing or testing the old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. So they've done a bunch of studies, weight loss studies and other studies, testing eating a large breakfast and a small dinner compared to eating a small breakfast and a large dinner. So, are you eating most of your calories early in the day or late in the day? And in one of the most important studies they've done, which is about a 3-month-long study in almost 100 overweight women, at random, they pick people to either eat most of their calories early in the morning, so to have a large breakfast and a small dinner, or to eat most of their calories late in the day, so small breakfast and large dinner. And they found that people who ate most of their calories early in the day lost significantly more weight. And not only did they lose more weight, but they were less hungry throughout the day when they ate that less large breakfast. I kind of like to look at this from the opposite perspective, which is the people who ate a small breakfast, who skimped on breakfast and then had a large dinner. Not only did they lose less weight, but they were more hungry despite struggling to lose more weight. So they were more hungry per kind of unit of weight loss. You can think of it that way. So they really struggled. So I find that an amazing result. That same research group has also done another study looking at the effects on blood sugar. So they did a 1 week long study in 18 people with type 2 diabetes, where they either had that large breakfast or that small breakfast. I realize these figures are a little hard to see, but it's kind of the best visual I have. But what you see if you actually trace the line is those who eat a large breakfast, if you kind of look at their average blood sugar levels over the course of the day, that average blood sugar level is actually lower in people who eat a large breakfast than those who eat a small breakfast. And they were also able to find in this study that after only 1 week of having people with type 2 diabetes eat more earlier in the morning, they actually were able to restore insulin secretion in these people. So when you have type 2 diabetes, your body struggles to produce insulin and you really need it to control your blood sugar. So they were able to show after only 1 week, they were able to improve that insulin secretion. And then the last study I want to show you, which I think is also a really, really neat study, is they've also tested the effects of eating a large breakfast on sex hormones and fertility. So they did a really nice 12-week study in 60 women who have something called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So basically they struggle with fertility. And what they found is that eating a large breakfast improved several hormones called androgens that are related to, sex hormones and fertility. And moreover, they were able to improve ovulation in this women. So they were able to, at the start of the study, no one was ovulating. At the end of the study, more than half of the people who were eating a large breakfast were able to ovulate again, which I find is pretty amazing. And what we now know is that on a molecular level, some of the same clock genes that produce 24-hour rhythms also produce rhythms shorter and longer than 24 hours, including the menstrual cycle. Awesome. So I saw some of this data. Gosh, it's been about 10 years now. And I thought, wow, this is really fantastic. Because I saw when it was right coming out. And I thought, what if we combine this daily intermittent fasting with eating early in the day to be in sync with our circadian rhythms and metabolism? Like our best blood sugar control in most people is early in the day. We burn slightly more calories when we eat early in the day. So it seems, like the morning is kind of best for eating. What if we combine the two? And what's the kind of maximum benefit we can get from being strategic on when we eat? So I call this type of approach where you combine daily intermittent fasting with eating early in the day, early time restricted eating. And the simple definition is it's equivalent to eating dinner sometime in the afternoon and stopping. So you're basically eating a very early dinner and then fasting for the rest of the day. So my research group at UAB we have 7 clinical trials on this. We've completed 3 trials. In most of our studies, I'll show you some of that data today. In most of our studies, we've asked people to eat within a 6 to 8 hour window. But since I know most of you are on this call wondering, what should I do? For most people, I recommend an 8 to 10 hour window. And you could start with the 10-hour window and kind of work your way down. I think 6 is really only appropriate for someone who's going for aggressive weight loss, just because it's so hard to eat all your food in a short period. So I think 8 to 10 hours is a good target for most people. One of the first studies we did is we were looking at the question, does time-restricted eating have intrinsic benefits? So one of the big debates among researchers is, why is intermittent fasting beneficial? Is it beneficial just because it helps you lose extra weight? Are there benefits beyond weight loss, or benefits not attributed to that weight loss? So my lab did an eating study in 8 men with prediabetes. And we had those 8 men either eat 3 meals over 12 hours and fast for 12 hours until their next meal, or they tried the early time restricted eating. So they ate the same 3 meals, but they fasted for 18 hours a day. And each of the 8 men tried both of the schedules. And then what we did is we looked at, okay, which schedule did they do better on? And the really neat thing about this study is we provided all the food for them to eat, so that if there were any differences between groups, we would know that it's just due to the time of day that they ate, not because one group ate less than the other. So what we found in our study is we found that the early time restricted eating improved blood sugar control. We looked at something called insulin resistance, and a lower level here tells us a greater improvement in blood sugar control happened. We also found some improvement in insulin secretion in something called beta cell responsiveness, but it's just a measure of how quickly your body can produce insulin. We also found about a 10 to 11 point improvement in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So those are pretty big improvements on par with what you can get from medications. And we found some improvements in molecular damage and no difference in heart rate or cholesterol levels. In a second study my lab did, we were trying to answer the question, okay, it looks like a lot of these time-restricted eating studies help people lose weight. Why are they helping people lose weight? And anytime you lose weight, it's because either you're eating less and or you're burning more calories. And there are a bunch of different ways you can burn more calories, such as to exercise more, or maybe to rev up your metabolism intrinsically, or there's some other ways as well. And what we found in this study, we did, I'll backtrack. We did a 4-day study in 11 people. And what we did in the study is on the 4th day, we put people in a special room where we measured how many calories they burned. And what we found is that the early time restricted eating does not affect how many calories people burn. So they burn the same amount, whether they were eating over a 12-hour period or doing the early time restricted eating. However, we did find some changes in appetite. So we found that the early time restricted eating actually kind of made hunger more even keeled. So the swings in hunger across the day were less. And we also found that the early time restricted eating reduced certain appetite hormones. So there's special hormones called ghrelin and PYY. And we found that early time restricted eating actually improved hormones involved in hunger. So we think these time restricted eating approaches or these intermittent fasting approaches don't help you burn more calories. So there's no magic, magic help there with burning calories, but we do think that they help improve or reduce your hunger. Also in that study, we measured fat burning over a 24-hour period. And what was really interesting is when we looked at that data, the first 12 hours of the day, there really wasn't any difference in fat burning, whether you did time restricted eating or not. But you can see once you get to the evening and you've been fasting a few hours, there's actually a big increase in fat burning, which is represented by this dip in the curve here. And we actually found over about a 12-hour period from around 8 p.m. In the evening until 8 a.m. the next day, there was a big increase in fat burning in people who did early time restricted eating. And we also found in that study, this was one of the first studies to measure blood sugar levels over a 24-hour period. We also found in that study that if we looked at blood sugar levels in people who did the early time restricted eating or who ate across the day, we actually found that the average blood sugar levels were actually lower. If you average this across the day, this dark, thick black line, those average glucose or blood sugar levels were lower in people who did the early time restricted eating. And we actually also found that spikes in blood sugar were lower. So it actually helps just in general keep your blood sugar better under control. And then the third study that my lab has done that I'll tell you briefly about that we're just in the process of publishing and getting out there is we wanted to see if early time restricted eating was better than standard dieting for weight loss. So we did the largest study. This is actually to date the largest study of comparing time restricted eating versus standard dieting, where both groups got the same sort of counseling to lose weight. So our study was about 3.5 months long, and it was in 90 people who had obesity and who wanted to lose weight. And it was done through the UAB Weight Loss Medicine Clinic. And in our study, each person was either asked to eat over 12 hours or longer each day. So that was our quote unquote control group. Or they did early time restricted eating by eating between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. So, and I realize this is a little bit of an extreme schedule, but we're kind of interested in the general question, does meal timing even affect weight loss? And indeed, we found in this study that time restricted eating did help people lose weight. We're actually in the process of updating these figures, so this is not the final version, but it illustrates the principles. So we did find that early time restricted eating helps people lose weight. It also helped them lose body fat And it did not, the important thing is it did not negatively affect their muscle mass, or what we call fat-free mass or lean mass. So no negative effects on muscle mass. And yes, there was a benefit in our study for weight loss. We also found in our study, we found an improvement in diastolic blood pressure. We found some differences in systolic blood pressure. They weren't quite what we call statistically significant, but they were close. And we did not find any changes in heart rate, in cholesterol levels, or in some indicators of blood sugar. But we did find some benefits of early time-restricted eating for weight loss and improving blood pressure. We also looked at sleep and mood in this study. We found that early time-restricted eating, when you practice it, it takes about an extra 7 more minutes to fall asleep at night. But otherwise, it doesn't either not negatively or positively affect your sleep. For mood, we actually found that the early time-restricted eating affects a lot of different aspects of mood. So people reported feeling more energy, having less fatigue, and having fewer feelings of depression or dejection. And overall, we found it reduced something called the total mood disturbance, or you can think of it as the total number of mood issues. So there does seem to be benefits for mood, which we're pretty excited about, because this is one of the first studies to establish or to show that intermittent fasting may have some benefits for mood. So to kind of wrap up, I know I covered a ton of ground in a short period of time. This is cutting edge research. We actually don't have a lot of the answers yet, but I hope I've given you a teaser of what we know and what we don't know. You probably had just as many questions as you got answers on this webinar, and that's just because that's where we are with all our research on intermittent fasting. But let me try to draw some takeaway messages for everyone. So first, I would say not all forms of intermittent fasting may be sustainable in the long term. Some of the earlier forms of intermittent fasting I showed you, I might call them a little bit too extreme or intense, because people really struggle to stick with them in the long term. So these approaches where, you do a full 24-hour fast every other day, I just recommend, because they're really hard to stick to and are pretty extreme. However, there are plenty of other forms of intermittent fasting that are more doable, particularly the time-restricted eating. Second, I'd say there's tentative, albeit conflicting evidence suggesting that intermittent fasting helps you lose weight and may improve many aspects of health. Much of the benefits of intermittent fasting do seem to come from the weight loss itself, though the results do seem to vary by the type of intermittent fasting. Among the different intermittent fasting approaches, I'm probably most bullish or most excited about time-restricted eating, but I would say I'm also really excited by some of the research on eating a large breakfast, and I think that research is pretty compelling and suggests that both the time-restricted eating and eating a large breakfast help with weight loss, blood sugar, and blood pressure. But we still need larger and longer studies before we see public nutrition guidelines change. But I will predict that sometime in the next decade, we'll probably have enough research to start writing dietary guidelines on when to eat and so forth. And then lastly, since I know the subtitle of my talk was, should we eat breakfast or not? The data is still kind of mixed on this, because if you skip breakfast and eat dinner late, we know that's not good for you. However, if you skip breakfast and you eat dinner at a normal time, maybe you're missing some of the benefits of eating earlier in the day, but you get some of the benefits of intermittent fasting. So we don't exactly know whether that particular approach of skipping breakfast and eating at a normal time is good or bad for you yet. But I do have some studies trying to answer exactly that question. So lastly, just to wrap up, I often get asked, who can I go to get advice on intermittent fasting? Unfortunately, there are not many clinical practitioners that I know of or can recommend. My lab does have 3 studies for anyone who is interested in participating, learning a little bit of intermittent fasting and trying it with some support and guidance. So we have one study called the Clock Study, and this is for adults with type 2 diabetes who are not on insulin. And we pay $2,400 for participating in the study. And if you're interested, you can follow the link on the screen to apply. We have a second study. It's a really neat study where we're trying to see whether the time of day that you practice time-restricted eating matters. Like, can you get just as many benefits by skipping breakfast as you can, by eating an early dinner? So we're really trying to answer, the $1 million question: can you skip breakfast, do intermittent fasting, and still get benefits? In this study, we're looking for people who do not have type 2 diabetes, but who do have extra weight they want to get rid of and or have blood sugar issues. In this particular study, it's an eating study. So we actually provide 8 weeks of meals. And plus, if you complete the study, we pay $1,200. And then our last study, if you don't have type 2 diabetes and don't have extra weight you're losing, we have a study coming up to see if intermittent fasting can slow the aging process. And for this study, we're looking for adults who are at a healthy or normal weight between the ages of 25 to 45. And if you're interested, we'll start looking for people to participate this summer, so you can contact Lynn. And with that, I'll wrap it up and take any questions.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for the great information. We do have questions already in. And if anybody has questions, go ahead and toss them in the chat room. Let's start out with, can you, or is intermittent fasting good for runners or people committed to any kind of competitive sports?
Yes, as far as we can tell, there are no negative effects. Most of the studies find no improvement in performance either, so they don't seem to help or hurt your sports performance or lifting abilities. But there are only about maybe 4 or 5 studies right now in adults who are exercising.
Okay. So can nursing mothers participate in intermittent fasting in a modified form?
Oh, great question. We generally recommend, just out of an abundance of caution, for nursing mothers not to do intermittent fasting. Just because we don't know, what we know is intermittent fasting slows down the rate at which cells grow and divide. And so we would generally recommend not doing it. We don't recommend intermittent fasting in children because they're still growing and we don't want it to stunt their growth. Some of the studies in animals where they take like young rats and do intermittent fasting, those rats just don't do as well in the long term because it kind of stunts their growth. It may be fine. We just don't know. So I would just, at an abundance of caution, just recommend not doing it in nursing mothers. And I say definitely not do it in children.
Can people with diet restrictions, vegans, etc., do intermittent fasting?
Absolutely. You can, the great thing about intermittent fasting is you can do it with regardless of what kind of diet you're eating right now. And one of the really nice things about it is like a really simple, easy rule. It's not like eat this food, don't eat this food. It's just a few rules on, a couple of rules on when you start eating and when you stop eating.
What is considered breaking your fast? Is having a Diet Coke at 9 a.m. when you're at break, or maybe you fast until 11 o'clock? What is breaking the fast?
Yeah, great question. Generally, it's anytime you eat something with an appreciable amount of calories. So if you drink water with a squeeze of lemon, you're not breaking your fast. If you're having coffee without cream or sugar, you're not breaking your fast. But if you have coffee with cream and sugar, you're breaking your fast.
Gotcha. So while you are on your fast, can you use stevia or monk fruit?
Oh, I don't know monk fruit as well, so I can't comment on that one. I don't remember the calorie content of stevia. I believe it's negligible. And if my memory is correct, then you could use it. But I'm not 100% confident on that.
Okay. Somebody was asking about the links for the studies. I'm going to try to put those back up.
Yes.
Hopefully it'll start out the last slide, so we'll keep that up for a little bit. There you have it. You've got the clock study, the meal timing study, as well as the slow aging study. So what is considered a large breakfast? Is it the amount of calories that you're looking at?
Yeah, so it's the amount of calories you're looking at. In the studies that I mentioned today, people were eating 50% of their calories at breakfast in the large breakfast group. And those who ate the large dinner were eating about 50% of their calories at dinner. And just for reference, the median American eats about 40% of their calories at dinner time.
Okay. So if you are doing TRE, what's the best time to exercise?
Oh, we don't know the answer to that question, but there are a few studies that suggest it's better to exercise before breakfast. So there are probably about 3 or 4 good quality studies that suggest that people actually lose more weight and have lower appetite when they exercise in the fasted state than if they exercise after eating breakfast. With the one exception being people with type 2 diabetes, it seems like for them it's better to exercise in the afternoon.
Do you think the type of food we eat for breakfast is a part of the reason why maybe the research is leading people into the ways that you've discussed?
Could you say that question once more?
Do you think the types of food we eat as breakfast, the big meal at breakfast, kind of help in the research?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there's a lot of eating of certain breakfast cereals that may spike your blood sugar levels that may not be as good. So I think that's part of it. I think people are also just looking for things that are easier to do, and this is a pretty easy approach. And then the other thing I would say, there's a lot of interest in low carb diets and a lot of interest in combining fasting with low carbohydrate diet. We don't have any good research on this yet, but I know a lot of people are self-experimenting and combining the two, and anecdotally report that it's easier to do intermittent fasting when they eat lower carb diets. I don't personally myself eat a lower carb diet, but I do eat like a lower glycemic diet.
For the studies, do you have to be in Birmingham or around Birmingham to participate?
As long as you can drive to all your appointments, and don't mind the commute time, you can participate. But they all do require appointments at UAB.
Okay. Was water intake part of the studies that you've done?
No, we haven't looked at water intake, but what we have noticed is that a small but significant fraction of people report being thirstier when they do intermittent fasting and or running into problems where they just feel a little more dehydrated. So we just encourage people to drink more water. And that may be, I mentioned like really early in the presentation that intermittent fasting helps your body get rid of extra sodium. In that process, you may need to drink extra water, but the upside is it's lowering your blood pressure.
What are the effects on triglycerides and lipids?
Generally, we only see if that intermittent fasting helps with triglycerides and cholesterol levels when people lose weight, but they're done. But, so all the benefits of intermittent fasting on cholesterol and triglyceride levels just seem to be because people are losing weight. So said another way, if intermittent fasting helps you lose weight, it's probably helping with your cholesterol and triglycerides. But if it's not helping you lose weight, it's probably not helping.
Is late eating just pretty much after dark or 5 p.m.?
We see, it depends on how you want to define it, but we see even starting in, the middle of the afternoon, we see a worsening of people's blood sugar control. So, generally I will define late eating as yes, eating after 5 p.m. or eating, in the evening or after the sun goes down. But we do even see some differences as early as the afternoon in people's metabolisms. It truly, in most people, with the exception of shift workers and people with type 2 diabetes, your metabolism peaks in the morning. And that's kind of the best time of day, we think, to eat. I think I had another response to that, but I've forgotten it now.
Is there a typical calorie goal during the eating window?
No. And that's the really nice thing about it. So you can maintain your weight if you'd like, or you can lose weight if you like. For those who want to lose weight, general recommendations are to target reducing your calories by 15 to 30%. 15% for slow, gradual weight loss, 30% for aggressive weight loss. Beyond that's really hard to sustain.
This person says, I know you talked about eating early, but would there still be a benefit for a big breakfast, even if you don't start to eat until later in the day?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. There's some studies out of Spain that look at what happens. So in Spain, no joke, the median lunch time is 2:45 p.m. And they found that people who eat lunch earlier in the day in Spain versus later in the day in Spain lose more weight when they're enrolled in a weight loss study. So yes, I suspect if you front load most of your calories to breakfast and lunch, you're getting most of that benefit. It doesn't.
The last question that we'll have you answer, and we have so many of them, but we are up against the clock. Have the benefits such as weight loss let me rephrase that. Have the benefits such as weight loss long lasting? Were there follow-ups 1 year later where people might have gained the weight back? What have you been able to determine from those?
No, the longest studies we have are only 1 year long. Unfortunately, the field is just so young. And we probably only have on the order of about 6 studies that are a year long now. So we really need more research in this area, but I think it is coming.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Very insightful, great information. Just, we know based off the audience, this was something that was going to be very popular. And we delved into it, and you gave us some good things to think about as we move forward in the new year. And I'm sure a lot of us have made New Year's resolutions to kind of cut back and be better about their diet and how they're eating.
Yes, thank you. Well, I hope this was helpful for everyone, and I hope everyone learned some new things about intermittent fasting today.
So thank you so much. And a reminder, recording of tonight's presentation will be available online starting tomorrow. And be sure to join us for other upcoming webinars that we have. On Thursday, January 27th, we will welcome Carol Donovan for your last phase of planning. Join us as we explore pre-need funeral and cremation planning. On Tuesday, February 8th, we will host Alumni Travel Night 2022. Discover travel opportunities we have available for alumni, including trips to Europe, the Canadian Rockies, and Antarctica. On Tuesday, April 12th, be part of Diet and Brain Health. During this webinar, we'll find out what our diet needs to look like in order to protect and maintain our cognitive function. And on Thursday, May 19th, laugh it up with Dr. Kevin Fontaine during comedy. Just say yes. Find out what makes something humorous and why laughing makes us feel better. You can register for all these webinars at alumni.uab.edu/events. And we're excited to invite you to our first ever casino night at the Alumni House on Thursday, February 24th. Hit the jackpot while supporting student scholarships. Tickets are only $30 and include food and a starter set of chips to gamble throughout the evening. The evening will include blackjack, roulette, craps, and Texas Hold'em, as well as a cash bar and opportunity to purchase keys that could unlock liquor lockers. Find out more at alumni.uab.edu/casino. And let us help get you through your day or commute. Listen into the UAB Green and Filled podcast. New episodes are released every other week and feature members of the UAB community. Meet one of the first persons to put on the Blaze mascot, meet an Army general, and discover why alumni chose their career paths that they actually took. Download the podcast on Spotify and the Apple Podcast app, or visit our website. And be sure to stay on top of all things alumni on social media. You can look us up by searching UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On LinkedIn, just search Alumni Career Community. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar with Dr. Courtney Peterson. Have a great evening. And as always, go Blazers.